All right, well, let's get started. Welcome to this event, Understanding Adolescent Vulnerabilities in Lower Middle Income Countries through an Intersectional Lens. It's a launch of a new European Journal of Development Research special issue. So my name is Rebecca Tiessen, and I'm a professor at the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa, and I'll be chairing the session today. I'm also a member of the European Journal of Development Research editorial board, and I'm delighted to introduce this event and to facilitate some of the discussions that we'll be having today. A few housekeeping matters. First, note that you've been muted upon entry to this meeting, and this will help minimize the background noise. And we ask you to keep your camera off during the event, just to keep the internet connection good for everyone that's participating. This meeting is being recorded, and it may be shared on the GAGE website and a YouTube channel. I just want to start by saying a few words about how important this special issue is to the journal. As a member of the editorial team for EJDR, it is such a privilege to review outstanding work, and especially to receive this brilliant collection. The special issue examines the challenges and opportunities, the structural inequalities, as well as agency, capabilities, and resilience of marginalized adolescents in lower middle income countries. The empirical work comprising this study fills an important gap in scholarship, specifically in relation to adolescent girls' experiences, but also broader societal realities and policy contexts that support or restrict opportunities for adolescent girls to thrive and to flourish. Not only does this study provide valuable and context-specific findings, it also sets the tone for future research and analysis with its well-developed and informative conceptual lens. And best of all, the articles are open access and available to everyone on the EJDR website. It was published in August in 2021. And you can find also the links to these EJDR articles on the GAGE website. You'll have the opportunity to learn more about this special issue today, as well as engage in dialogue on these important topics. I'll give you a quick overview of the agenda today. There are 4 parts to our meeting. We'll start with our panel presentations for 30 minutes. Then we'll have question and answer for 8 minutes, breakout room discussions for 30 minutes, and a report back for about 10 minutes, ending with a few concluding comments. During the panel session, please use the chat box to type your questions, and we'll try to address those at the end of the panel session. I would now like to briefly introduce the panelists. While there are many authors and even a larger group of researchers involved in this research team, today we'll hear from the following. To present on what an intersectional lens brings to our understanding of adolescent experiences in lower and middle income countries, we have Professor Camfield, Laura Camfield. Professor Laura Camfield works on research capability strengthening and integrating qualitative and quantitative methods at the University of East Anglia, where she's also the head of the School of International Development. And she'll be joined in that discussion with Dr. Khadija Mitu, who is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Chittagong in Bangladesh. She's trained in anthropology and has expertise in qualitative research, development studies, medical anthropology, and technology and gender studies. And she's currently working on research projects analyzing the development and well-being of adolescents and youth. In the second set of discussions, we'll talk about whether and how mixed methods research helps us to understand the intersections that shape adolescent lives. And starting off that session will be Dr. Sarah Baird, who's a professor of global health and economics at George Washington University and the quantitative lead for the Gender and Adolescence Global Evidence, the GAGE study, where she focuses on microeconomics of health and education in low and middle income countries. She'll be joined by Professor Laura Camfield and Professor Tassew Woldehanna. I introduced already Professor Camfield. Professor Tassew Woldehanna is the president of Addis Ababa University, a position he's had since 2018, and a professor of economics at the university. He's a development economist interested in fiscal incidence, child welfare and poverty, employment, and microcredit. micro and small scale enterprise development. And the third panel will be the role that this special issue has to advance discussions on policy and programming priorities for adolescents in lower and middle income countries. And that will be kicked off by Roberta Simbi and followed by Professor Tassew Woldehanna with some additional comments. So I'll now turn the floor over to our panelists to begin our discussions. Over to you, Professor Camfield.
Hello. Hi, I'm Laura Camfield. I'm very excited to be talking about this special issue. A great deal of work has gone into it from EJDR's side and our own, and it's good to be coming together to celebrate it now. So could I have the next slide, please? I wanted to give you a brief introduction to the concept of intersectionality. It's something that has a very particular history. It's also become very politicized, particularly in the US. But we found it useful within GAGE to look at how multiple aspects of people's identity combine to produce disadvantage in particular contexts. For example, the way age and gender increase vulnerability to early marriage or premature entry into the labour market. Crenshaw, who originated the concept, looked at this in relation to the failures of legislation around employment discrimination. Black women were seen as neither representing the experiences of Black people because they were women, or women because they were Black. And so it wasn't possible to argue that they were experiencing discrimination, even though they clearly were. And we actually see this kind of catch-22 in UN human rights legislation as well. Parent et al. Helpfully extend this to look at three aspects of intersectionality. So structural intersectionality, how people experience things in a manner that's qualitatively different from the way that others experience them according to the different social groups they're located within. Political intersectionality, where laws and policies intended to increase equality have paradoxically decreased the visibility, for example, of violence against non-white women in the US. And representational intersectionality, where particular portrayals of particular groups often obscure their own authentic lived experiences. And I think this will come out particularly strongly in the session that we have on disability at the end of the speakers. So to capture this, and particularly to address these questions on the slide, it's very important that we have a holistic and a multi-scalar methodology, and that's something that Sarah is going to discuss in detail shortly. But just to link it to our conceptual framework, if I could have the next slide, please, Aggie. The way in which our methodology, our research approach is intersectional is because it's bottom up, and it also goes beyond the obvious sources of disadvantage. And this is possible through knowledge of the communities. We work with very, very experienced local researchers. We also did extensive qualitative research at the outset and drew on often long histories of research in these communities to get a sense of what the main divisions were, what the important identities were, and how these then intersected. So it's bottom up, it goes beyond obvious sources of disadvantage, and it also links individuals and structures. And the way in which we do this is by drawing on a range of qualitative and quantitative data. So not just individual testimonies, although those are very important, and obviously we don't hear that much from adolescents at the moment, but it looks in detail at the sorts of structures that adolescents engage with, for example, the school. And finally, it captures adolescents' agency and voice through a plurality of very engaging methods. And this is something that Sarah will shortly describe. So we bring all these elements together. It's a really comprehensive research methodology in order to properly realize our vision of capturing intersectionality, because it's very easy to talk about, but actually quite hard to do in practice. And you get some sort of sense of this if you have a look at the cartoon, where researchers can seem to be kind of reinventing the wheel, because suddenly we're all about intersectionality and how everything is interwoven and connected and complex and so on. But these are obviously truths that have been well known for quite a long period of time in the sorts of cultures in which we're working. So I won't, I only have a few minutes, I know, so I'll happily hand over to Khadija at this point to talk perhaps particularly about how this has been done in the context we've been working in Bangladesh.
Khadija, can you just unmute, please?
Oh, I'm really sorry.
No worries.
Thank you, Laura, for explaining the concept very nicely. And what we have found in our ethnographic research, the qualitative research, the that we conducted in the context of Rohingya refugee children in Bangladesh has, gives us a very good example of this intersectionality. We talk to married and unmarried girls. We talk to their parents, adolescent boys and young men, and the community leaders as well as the humanitarian organization people. And then what emerged from this research is that the complex and intersecting role of age, gender norms, religious ideals in the forced displacement context from Myanmar to Bangladesh, and poverty compounded the very limited livelihoods opportunities in the refugee camps. And all of these intersecting factors negatively affects the well-being of adolescent girls' lives. And we found very interesting differences between married and unmarried girls' experiences. We found that unmarried girls' experiences are more revolving around their confinement and mobility restrictions. They emphasize paramount importance of the veiling practices to protect their honor and their marriage prospects. And this translated into confinement in highly overcrowded tents, being cut off from learning centers, the only educational opportunities afforded by Rohingya children in Bangladesh, and to social isolation, even from their neighbors and the peers in some cases. In contrast to that, married adolescent girls underscored the urgency of economic opportunities, especially those who had young children, and a willingness to break taboos against women as economic earners out of desperation, given extreme poverty and food insecurity. We also found that married girls faced increased gender-based violence risks. Survey data revealed that married girls are twice as likely to have experienced gender-based violence than unmarried girls, including intimate partner violence. Married girls also face graver mental distress due to the pressures that young married couples face in the absence of adequate services and support. And we present strong evidence to suggest that mental health outcomes are worse among married adolescents. While community focus groups suggested that norms are shifting for older Rohingya women, married adolescent girls particularly are excluded from social participation or personal growth beyond the household. So their refugee and displaced situation, their economic confinement, economic scarcity, their gender norms and age and the religious ideals are intersecting and sort of compounding all this negative situation for them. So I think that we presented in our paper that it's a very good example of intersectionality, that how all these factors affect their lives. Thank you.
Thank you both so much, Professor Camfield and Dr. Mitu. Wonderful introduction. To those of you who are just joining us now, thank you for joining us. We're moving on to the second presentation now, whether and how mixed methods research helps us to understand the intersections that shape adolescent lives. So I'll invite Professor Sarah Baird to begin her comments.
Great, thank you so much, Rebecca, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who's joined us. I just want to kind of also acknowledge the sort of echoing Laura's comments, the sort of immense amount of work that went into the special issue and the large number of co-authors that are both presenting today, but also those that are attending and those that are unable to make it. So thanks so much for sort of a massive collective effort sort of across continents. So I want to focus today on the role of mixed methods and how it helps us unpack questions around the intersections that shape adolescents' lives and capabilities. Next slide, please. But before kind of getting into that, I want to briefly talk about the GAGE research design, because what is unique about GAGE from my perspective is that it was mixed methods from the start and putting an equal emphasis on both. So it wasn't kind of qualitative led with a little bit of quant behind the scenes or quantitative led with a little bit of qual behind the scenes. It really set forth to really do rigorous and intense quantitative and qualitative methods to really be able to put a foot forward of being sort of a truly mixed methods design. The numbers that you see on this slide also illustrate the scope of the project. 20,000 quantitative surveys with adolescent girls and boys aged 10 to 12 and 15 to 17 in particular. Not only did we survey the adolescents, but we also wanted to understand the people they interact with and the context in which they live. So we also had surveys with female and male caregivers and surveys with community leaders and school personnel to give a kind of quantitative look at their own perspectives, but also the perspective of the parents and the different services they were interacting with. This quantitative data is complemented by 800, a sample size of 800 for qualitative research, which is, as you all know, very large. Qualitative research takes a number of different forms, including in-depth interviews with nodal adolescents, their siblings, caregivers, and community leaders, key informant interviews and historical process training, and policy and legal analysis to understand the politics of policy and program implementation. And the different papers in this special issue highlight these different themes of the qualitative research, and hopefully some of the panel members after me will speak to some of this. Combining this kind of quantitative and qualitative research, which is longitudinal in nature, right? So we're following these adolescents over time, which adds another dimension to this work. We also have an annual participatory sample of around 200 adolescents who are conducting peer research and participatory photography. And for those of you who have not seen it, this photography is stunning and really sheds light on what kind of the lives that these adolescents lead and the challenges that they face. And there's also social network analysis to understand the involving influence of peer groups throughout adolescence. And I think having this range of methodologies really allows us to both provide breadth in terms of issues, but then also depth. And I think that's what mixed methods helps provide, is sort of that combination of breadth and depth. And I should also highlight that this is happening globally. So this is happening in Ethiopia, in Rwanda, in Bangladesh, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Palestine, and in Nepal. And so we have sort of a global lens with this mixed methods data. Next slide. So very briefly, I want to kind of highlight what in my mind mixed methods brings to the question, and then I'll hand over to Laura and then Tassew to add their thoughts as well. So I'm a quantitative researcher, so I sort of, that's where I come to the table, and I find that quantitative data kind of does a number of important things. I think first, it can really highlight puzzles that are happening in the data. And I know, for example, the work that I'm doing with well, there's a little feedback, sorry. With the paper I wrote with Dr. Woldehanna, we really highlighted sort of some interesting angles around what's happening around education in Ethiopia that he might talk to a bit more. But then once quantitative data highlights the puzzles, it doesn't necessarily shed light on why that puzzle exists. And I feel that qualitative data can really then dive deeper and help highlight why we might be seeing something that was unexpected in the quantitative data. But it also works the other way around, right? So qualitative data may elucidate certain themes that seem sort of unusual, things that we weren't expecting, and then we can go back to the quantitative data to sort of look more broadly about whether that's reflected in these more global data sets. A second issue I think that's important is with quantitative data, it can sometimes be very difficult to collect information on some of the more sensitive topics that are core to the lives of young people. This includes experience of discrimination, political attitudes, mental health, age and gender-based violence. And so I think that even though we may try to ask these in the quantitative data, being able to explore them in more depth in the qualitative data really adds value to what we're doing. And I think with the GAGE research in particular, I think without qualitative exploration of these issues, we would really just be brushing the surface of what's going on in these adolescents' lives and wouldn't be able to bring to light the true level of challenges that some of these adolescents are facing in these areas. And then I think that goes to my final point. You know, many policymakers really want the quantitative data, right? They want something that's generalizable, that's broad, that speaks to national priority issues, and that comes from a kind of representative sample of adolescents. That said, as my qualitative colleagues rightly note that the qualitative research can really bring the urgency of action to life through these sort of human stories and voices. And so if the quantitative data can get the ear of the policymaker, I think then the qualitative data can really provide those stories, the voices from the ground of sort of what does it mean to be experienced gender-based violence? What does it mean to have adverse mental health, or the opposite, right? So this is sort of focusing on the negative side of things, but what does it then mean to overcome these things, and what does that suggest about future policy and programs? So let me now I think I'm handing over to Laura next to perhaps share her additional thoughts on mixed methods data.
Thanks very much, Sarah. That's you've really well conveyed the extremely comprehensive nature of GAGE data collection. It's a bit sort of mind-boggling, and I think you also have a sense of the analytical task that faced us as we produced the articles for the special issue. So some of the aspects that are particularly notable, as Sarah said, is that we try to set adolescents in the broadest possible context, because we want to see the connections between different aspects of their lives, and I suppose also how they change and their experiences change across contexts. So we look at them with their families, with their peer groups, in their communities, particularly in their schools. We look at particular programs they might be experiencing at national and international legislative frameworks. And so then there's the big analytical challenge of trying to bring all this data together, particularly because it's collected over time. We're also trying to use appealing and age-specific tools, and Sarah's talked a little bit about this. It is challenging to engage adolescents, and now I have an adolescent of my own, I'm very aware of this. You need quite high-quality tech. We can't sort of turn up with poor-quality mobile phones because people don't want to engage with them and use them. But it is so important that adolescents can express themselves in a way that they feel most comfortable. I see with my daughter the frustration she experiences at being asked, for example, to draw something when she'd much rather create an animation on a phone. So we've worked quite hard with adolescents to find the ways in which they prefer to communicate, and that's obviously particularly challenging working with adolescents with disabilities. So this is something else that Sarah's flagged, which is the importance of building rapport over time, because we are talking about topics that are inherently sensitive, and we want the adolescents to trust the people that they're working with. So as far as possible, we've tried to keep the research teams the same. I think finally the most interesting aspect about GAGE is that it is essentially an evaluation, but it's an evaluation like no other for all the reasons that Sarah's explained. And we hope that it will raise the ambition of similar projects in the future. For example, the sort of work that we're doing trying to ensure the meaningful participation of clients or beneficiaries in telling the story of their lives, but also having this wide contextual knowledge so we can identify, for example, adverse and unexpected reactions that might not be picked up with a more linear and less far-reaching design. So I'll hand over, I think, to Tassew, who's going to give some concrete examples from the work in Ethiopia.
Okay, thank you. I think the quantitative methodology and the qualitative methodology have all their own strengths, and when we mix them, gives us a very rich result. Quantitative survey or qualitative analysis shows us what happens in that point in time. It doesn't tell us how that comes, how that situation is explained. If we have a longitudinal data, it tells us, how the two situations are in different point in time. It doesn't tell us more than that. But when we have a qualitative information, either through participatory research or through qualitative survey, it explains us how things are changing, how we are changing from one point, from one phenomena to another phenomena, or in the economics terminology, how we are moving from one equilibrium point to another equilibrium point. Let me give you a few examples how this mixed method helps us to give us a rich results. In the quantitative method, we found out that there is a positive association between adolescents' decision-making power and education outcome, maybe completion and dropout, all those outcomes of education. And we found also that there is a negative association between exposure to violence or practice of violence and education outcome. And negative association between child work, could be paid, unpaid, with the education outcome. So this relationship is obtained from the quantitative survey, then we make an econometric analysis. It shows us whether there is a significant relationship between the two situations. Then we don't know how that happens. How is children's decision-making power is affecting education outcome? It doesn't tell us. The quantitative doesn't tell us. But the qualitative information tell us, when adolescents have a decision-making power, and then they explain in their own words what kind of power they have and how they interact with the household to change the decision that's made by parents. And then that, in some cases, make them adolescents to prioritize education instead of work. And also they have the power to delay early marriage. If they delay early marriage, then they will focus more on education and they will have better school completion. If we don't have this qualitative information that we get from the participatory research or from the qualitative survey, we would depend on guessing, or maybe we depend on theory. It might not apply to that situations. So this qualitative method helps us to describe what is happening and how things are changing from time to time, and why things are related to each other. So this mixed method has helped us, to provide a rich result, convincing results that can we take to policymakers and practitioners so that they affect their practices. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. So for those of you joining, just a reminder that we would welcome any questions that you have. I see some questions are coming up on the chat, and we'll come to those questions at the end of this session. We're moving now to the third topic presentation, the role that this special issue has to advance discussions on policy and programming priorities for adolescents. So I'll turn it now to Ms. Roberta Isimbi.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me well. First slide, please. We will be discussing how the policy implication of the special issues. We will be using examples from the Rwandan context. The first slide, you can see it is summarized, but you can see that it's very easy that the differentiated experiences and needs of adolescents can be forgotten from the policy discussions, because as you can see, only 18 of the 232 Sustainable Development Goals targets are disaggregated by both gender and age, meaning that while the countries are developing and financing national action plans to achieve the Agenda 2030, the adolescents and the age and gender implications that are not covered in the goals, they are likely to be forgotten. So in the special issue, next slide, please. So we discuss how this special issue helps to advance discussions on policy and programming priorities for adolescents, especially those in low and middle income countries. So across the special issue articles, we have made at least 3 key points about implications for policy. Discussing one by one, I will be also bringing in some examples from Rwanda, as I will highlighting the findings from the research with adolescent mothers. As you can see in the first grid, the introduction to the special issue, when introducing the special issue, my GAGE colleagues have highlighted the importance of going beyond just an instrumentalist focus on youth, for example, harnessing youth for economic growth, but instead developing policies and programs that can respond to the complex experiences, the needs, and the aspirations for different adolescents. Looking at the research with adolescent mothers in Rwanda, the research showed that to meet the complex interconnected ways in which pregnancy and motherhood affect adolescent lives, be it in terms of limited education, social exclusion, worries about themselves and their child, the internalized and enacted stigma, or the limited economic opportunities, a package of coordinated support involving services from multiple sectors is in their capabilities. The special issue highlights the need for awareness of adolescents' complex and diverse experiences among policy actors from a range of government sectors. This includes the actors in the education field, health, justice, and economics, to name only those major ones. On the second point, an intersectional lens that the special issue focuses on also underscores the need to pay attention to adolescents' evolving needs over the course of the second decade of life and to invest in interventions that provide long-term age-tailored services and support. So returning to the example of our research in Rwanda on adolescent motherhood, our interviews with younger adolescent girls highlight that they have very limited access to information about puberty, sexual and reproductive health, and contraception. As they grow older, the limited access to information is also compounded by the poor access to services, especially those who are pregnant, because they are also subject to high levels of discrimination due to conservative gender norms. So sexuality out of wedlock is against the norms, so they are stigmatized for that. We also found that adolescent access to contraception is also shaped by the legal framework. Some provisions are not known, others are misinterpreted, but there are also the societal norms that stigmatize adolescent sexuality and gendered norms around coercive sex. Despite the legal provisions, the access to justice for sexual violence is also restrained, reflecting normative expectation that these matters can and should be dealt with privately by the girl's family, adding another layer of victimization to the girl. All of these challenges point to an urgent need to center adolescent girls at the heart of sexual and reproductive health policies and programming, especially in low and middle-income countries, and to develop policies and programs that accompany young people from early adolescence to as they transition through adulthood. A third point that the special issue has highlighted is an additional theme that emerges across this special issue. It's about the importance of systematically integrating an understanding of the ways in which young people's economic and social disadvantages can intersect, including in the commissioning and the generation of disaggregated data and research that can make visible these patterns of vulnerability, including within the SDGs. For the adolescents in our study in Rwanda, both the mothers and the non-mothers, they reported challenges to their bodily integrity from coercive sex and rape, but that's more likely to happen to adolescent mothers than to their peers. Coercive sex was reported linked to gendered norms and also poverty. However, the legal justice for sexual violence is rarely reported, impacting the voices and agency or capabilities of the adolescent mothers and reflecting on the stigma of having to disclose structural factors that have reduced also the trust and confidence in the justice system. We recognize the substantial investment and progress in justice services done by Rwanda for addressing sexual violence. However, adolescents and key informants in our studies identified stigma-related barriers to accessing and using these services. So this example is a key highlight on why it is critical for data and evidence around service usage and opportunities and constraints to consistently deploy in adolescent age and gender lens so that resources can be appropriately deployed in an evidence-informed way. So to that brief summary, I would like to hand over to my colleague, Professor Tassew, to also share his experience from the Ethiopian context. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think in this special issue, when we identify issues to be included in this special issue, then first, for the issues that we are discussing, we review the existing policy on girls. We review the existing policy on promoting decision power by decision power of adolescents, and the existing policies on mitigating peer violence, violence by teacher, violence by parents. So one of the tasks that we do is that we analyze policy and programs, existing programs. Then we enter into the analysis using the mixed method, and we get certain big results, rich results. Then how are we going to use these results is the issue. So it's not only concluding that decision-making power affects education outcome, or child labor is reducing girls' education. It should not end that. So how are we going, to influence policy? How are we going to influence practitioners so that they use this research result for their day-to-day use, or develop their policy influenced by the research? So in this special issue, we discuss on policies and programming that emerge from the quantitative and from the qualitative research. To give you an example, as I explained previously, we get a positive association between adolescents' decision-making power and education outcome. So improving the decision power of adolescents will help us in a main way to increase children's education outcome, and it empowers girls to determine their destiny, to determine their outcome. So then, how are we going to increase adolescents' decision-making power? What kind of programs are there that encourage children or adolescents to increase their decision power? What kind of programs are there? So from that analysis, then we try to do some recommendation based on this analysis. For example, if we introduce parenting program to rural and urban communities in order to increase the awareness of parents on the importance of increasing adolescents' decision-making power in girls, then this can be accepted by the government and by NGOs who are dealing with parents. So we are proposing there should be a parenting program. So we give priority programs that the NGOs and the government can follow. For example, we also prioritize programs like community awareness programs for reducing exposure or experience of peer violence among adolescents. If we reduce the violence, then that will help them to attend schools regularly and be empowered, and then increase their education outcome. And in Ethiopia, there are social assistance programs, social protection program. We can use them from this research. We can use them to increase adolescents' decision-making power. We can give them adolescents to engage more in education and increase their education outcome. Our social protection program is, for example, the productive safety net program is just handing out certain food, or providing food or cash on condition being they participate, they provide labor. But what if we can modify this social protection program, this social assistance program, that we provide support to parents on conditions that they send their children to school, they send the adolescents to school. So we can prioritize such kind of programs. So this special issue, not only in my paper where I am an author, but in all others, all the analysis and the results are linked to policies and programs that has to be prioritized by the government, by policymakers and the practitioners. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you to all of the panelists for your overview presentations this morning. So there are a few questions that have come in. I'm going to put 3 of those questions out to the panelists to start, possibly 4. I see more questions are coming in now, but these are the ones that we started with. So one is just a very specific question about the age bracket. So there are the 2 age brackets, and it seems that 13 to 14 was not included. And can you explain why that was the case? That's the first question. The second question has to do with the potential for ongoing research. So as Professor Camfield says, this raises the ambition of future research. What are some of those future research areas? And Professor Woldehanna really reinforced the importance of the ongoing data collection. So someone asked, what are survey and data, what regular conduct in Rwanda specifically, but maybe in other countries, What are the possibilities for ongoing data collection, especially disaggregated data collection? What recommendations might you have, or what are the possibilities for that ongoing work? And then the third question is about the ethical issues in safeguarding, because we are talking about adolescents. And so the question is, can you talk about some of the ethical safeguarding challenges around doing research with adolescent girls, particularly discussing sexual and reproductive health and rights issues in contexts where sexual activity for their age group is prohibited or socially unacceptable? So let's start with those three questions, and maybe we can start sort of at the top of the list for this round, and we maybe start at the bottom and move up on the second round. Would you like to start, Professor Camfield?
I think I'd probably like to hand over the, it's not strictly true to say that we excluded 13 to 14-year-olds, but I think that that's probably a question that Dr. Baird might prefer to answer.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, so it's a great question. So I think the quantitative data decided to focus on two cohorts. So the 10 to 12 and the 15 to 17 for a couple of main reasons. So the 10 to 12 was a focus, one, because they tend to be, we know a lot less about them, for example, because they're not part of DHS surveys. And so it seemed like a really important age group to focus on. In addition, by starting at 10 to 12, because we have this longitudinal data, we'll then really be able to see their transitions out of school, into marriage, into childbearing, et cetera, and be able to say something about those transitions. 15 to 17 was a choice of focus because they're already at the heart of a lot of those transitions, and because we wanted to be able to say something about early marriage, early pregnancy, transitions into work earlier on in the project, it was important to have that older age group. The reason for those two focuses was to have enough sample size dedicated to them to be able to say something important. And because we knew the 10 to 12-year-olds would eventually become 13 to 14-year-olds within a couple of years of our study, we would be able to have a lot to say about them eventually. Now, that said, the qualitative data did cover the full age range, the 10 to 19, and so they're not left out entirely. But it was our, with budgets always being a guiding force, we felt having more sample with two specific timeframes would allow us to contribute more to the existing literature. So that was kind of the goal. But as Laura said, they're not left out completely, just not a core focus.
Maybe I can add on this. 13, 14 is not age are not excluded, but we have two cohorts in the baseline. We will have overall three surveys: the baseline, the midline, and the end line. So in the baseline, we have two cohorts, 10 to 12 and 15 to 17. And then in the midline, this 10 to 12 will be 13, 14 age, and then the older one will be somewhat older. And then in the end line, this 10 to 12 years old at the baseline would be 15 to 17. So we are designing this age cohort in this way so that we explore from time to time across different age. And then we compare also different cohorts. For example, at the end line, we compare the younger cohort when it becomes 15 to 17 after 6 years. And then we compare it with the baseline of 15 to 17. This will give us a very rich idea and conclusion and changes over time across cohort, not only changes across the same children. So that is how we design the initial one. So 13, 14 will come back in the midline. The current analysis, these papers are mainly based on the baseline. And then in subsequent publications, you will see how longitudinal data will also cover the age of 13 and 14.
Thank you for that. Maybe we can move on to those two other questions. One is around, how does this, perhaps the GAGE data, how do they complement other data gathering exercises in terms of longer term data collection recommendations you might make for countries? And the last question about some of the ethical issues encountered potentially around working with adolescents and how safety was protected and ethics were addressed. And maybe we could start, I'm wondering with Mrs. Simby, if you want to comment a little bit on, how this data links with other data collection that the country was, question was specifically asked of Rwanda. So maybe we can start with you.
Yes, thank you. So specifically for Rwanda, there was a very limited focus of research project conducted, but very few focusing on adolescents in this age brackets. But especially in terms of longitudinal approach, they are not that I know of, and of this size as well. So in terms of complementarity, the data was very much needed and not in competition with any other research. And in terms of ethics, the ways the questions and the interactions are designed, it's very careful. For example, we avoid to ask any question that would leave the young person very curious, the adolescent curious, and then go ask about something harmful, so that they didn't know, but that they came to know because of their research, their participation in the research. So not only we seek approvals, we get reviews from the ethics committees and the National Institute of Statistics, we get approvals, but also in terms of phrasing, even the question level, it's very thought through.
Thank you. So we want to move to the breakout room discussions where we'll have a chance to have more conversations about these and other issues. I just want to give a little bit of information about the breakout rooms before we move into them. So you'll all be admitted to the selected breakout room based on your choice during the registration. And the breakout room leaders will take about 3 minutes to shed a little bit of light on the key issues first. We encourage everyone to be actively involved in the discussion, ask lots of questions, share your own thoughts, your own expertise, your own experience. And you'll be given a 1-minute countdown when we are ready to close the rooms, come back to the plenary for our final comments. I want to briefly introduce the breakout room leaders to you. So in breakout room 1, the focus will be on child marriage drivers in diverse LMIC contexts, including the experiences of girls and boys, and that'll be led by Dr. Bassam Abu Hamad. In breakout room 2, we have experiences of adolescents with disabilities, including differences based on context and type of impairment. And unfortunately, Dr. Ola Abu Al-Gab was not able to join us today. And so instead we have Dr. Nicola Jones, the Director of the Gender and Adolescents GAGE Program and Principal Research Fellow at ODI, who will facilitate that. And in breakout room 3, we have adolescent refugees and IDPs, which will be led by Dr. Kate Pincock. And she is the GAGE Qualitative Researcher, Research Associate at Oxford University. Just a quick reminder, you don't need to do anything to be admitted. The breakout rooms will start automatically, and we will all come back together at the end of our discussions. The next 30 minutes we'll come back. And if you have any problems, there is a help button in case of any technical difficulties, and we have a wonderful technical team working with us today that will hopefully be able to resolve anything. So we'll see you back in 30 minutes from now. Enjoy your discussions. Thank you so much to everyone for your contributions in the discussions in the breakout groups. Let's get an overview of what we heard in our conversations. And we'll start with the one that I had the opportunity to attend, and that's on child marriage drivers. So Dr. Abu Hamad, would you like to share some of the highlights from that conversation?
Yes, really the group discussed that that there are problems in the registration, and many child marriages remain unregistered, and especially the ones who were married before 15, so they go unnoticed in the national surveys, and the qualitative approach could be helpful in really picking them up. The main driver, so we not agree on which is more important, because these drivers intersect and interact. is the conservative cultural norm, which manifests, like, for example, in arranged marriages, consequence marriages, perception about woman, a woman role. The second is the economic driver, which really was also strong factor. It's not only poverty, it's rather the economic itself, because sometimes marriage improves the wealth of the family, or provide access to the girls to a better life. Sometimes they're gaining other things out of the marriage. Conflict also increases because it really triggers other drivers, especially poverty, unemployment, lack of security. So people think that marriage is a way to protect honor and safeguarding policy, especially they are too much worried about the girl and what happens to her, especially in case of because there's a lot of concern to maintain honor and sexual purity of the girl. Girls' law education attainment was also strong, and also weak legal and policy frame. Sometimes because the girls live very bad experiences, they're harmed like violence, so they think that marriage is a way to escape that. There are similarities in the different contexts, but still the magnitude of each one is different. So it's important to understand the context and respond to each context in a specific way, because although there's similarity, but still, these drivers are context specific. We found that intersectionality is very strong here, because like child people who are displaced, refugees, and drop out of school. So these vulnerabilities interact together. And one of the participants mentioned the Swiss cheese model that we need to create in order to control child marriage and eliminate it, using many protective layers, working, for example, in community awareness, working on policies, regulations, working on awareness, involvement of men. So having many layers to protect the girl, because child marriage will happen only when all these barriers are break down. So multi-sectorial intervention strategies that consider prevention, identification, good monitoring is a good strategy for that, particularly trying also to have a supportive legal frame, accompanied by work on awareness, and many of the programs failed before because they focus on one aspect, so they were narrow focused and short-term and short-sighted. So it's good to have a whole strategy for controlling that. So these are the main issues discussed in the group.
Thank you so much. Adding another layer to the intersectional approach here, we'll move to the next set of discussions around experiences of adolescents with disabilities, including differences based on context and type of impairment. I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Nicola Jones.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and apologies everyone, my camera is not working. So we had a rich discussion in our group reflecting on experiences from multiple contexts, including Ethiopia, Palestine, Myanmar, and the Dominican Republic. One of the key things that we reflected on was that adolescents with disabilities are often overlooked in research due to the additional resources and thought that are needed for data collection, but how critical it is, because even when services may be available, there can be many challenges even in diagnosing young people who have disabilities and getting them to the services that are needed. A key issue related to that was the way in which geography, particularly remote rural locations, then intersect with other vulnerabilities in terms of challenges to access services. And we heard that from multiple different contexts. So there's obviously a critical need, both in terms of data collection, but also then in terms of service delivery to proactively tackle the accessibility gaps. We also reflected, in addition to the diagnosis challenge, about the need for further nuancing of data collection tools to better understand the complexities of young people with disabilities experiences, and particularly in terms of understanding differences across impairment types. And then there was a very strong focus on the way that gender intersects to compound some of the challenges in realizing adolescent full capabilities, so that girls with disabilities in particular can face greater degrees of stigma when it comes to accessing sexual and reproductive health information and services. But just to end on a slightly more positive note, we did also discuss that there have been important advances, particularly in terms of inclusive education services for young people in some contexts, including Ethiopia. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And lastly, the discussions around adolescent refugees and IDPs, Dr. Kate Pincock.
Hi, I'll try and be super quick with this. I realise we're low on time. Yeah, thank you very much for those who came to the discussions. We had some great examples from Zimbabwe and from Bangladesh. In Zimbabwe, there's a lack of access to key services and a lack of communication in different corners of the region, and language barriers, and all of these create a legal kind of amplify the legal situation of refugees to make it very difficult to access services. From Bangladesh, we talked about Rohingya refugees who are unable to get refugee status, and policies don't allow them to receive formal education, only informal education. And this results in various impacts that change throughout the adolescence, so across the life course as they get older, and their mobility is further restricted as well due to gender norms. And so all of these intersect, so gender, age and refugee status, to kind of result in diminished capabilities for Rohingya girls. And then we also talked about the complexity of an intersectional approach compared to how policy and practice needs to affect large swathes of populations. So kind of translating those complex lived realities that are particular to small groups can be very challenging when it comes to coming up with policies and practices.
Wonderful, thanks so much. Well, we really did a pretty decent job of sticking to time. I'm impressed, a lot of people and a lot of conversations, and we're still really close to the finish time. So thank you all so much. I want to start by just noting how important this research is and how it offers a glimpse into, the need for additional research in this area to continue that conversation going and continue the research to make sure that we are able to explore these multiple dimensions, these intersectional realities using mixed methods approaches. I want to thank, first of all the participants who joined us today for your interest in this special issue and the research behind it, and for your contributions in the discussion. We would also like to thank FCDO, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office of the UK, for their support for the GAGE research. A quick note of thanks to the technical team supporting this event. You don't know much about them because they did such a great job and everything went so smoothly. So Gosia, Aggie, Ashla, Sylvia, Nicola, and Megan, thank you so much for all that you've done to make this such a great event. Let's continue the dialogue and continue to advocate for the changes to policies and programs needed to facilitate the empowerment of adolescent girls to make the changes that we want to see. And join me in showing your appreciation for this excellent event today, for the important work of the researchers and the GAGE team, perhaps with an emoji or a clapping hand or a word of thanks in the chat. And we'll take a minute to celebrate this event, and I'll end here. Thank you very much and goodbye.